the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
A couple of apologies first. Due to technical reasons, I'm having to do this on a mobile phone, so you'll see slightly less of me, which is probably a good thing. And also apologies from our usual host, Frank McKenna. He's at MIPIM in Cannes, doing important work at that really influential economic summit with a number of exciting downtown events where we're at the heart of things, as we usually are. But now let's turn to the subject for today's podcast and meet the new boss. Same as the old boss is a famous line from a song by my favourite band, The Who. It also describes what has happened today in Iran, where the son of the previous hardline leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has been chosen as the new Ayatollah. Does this strengthen the chance that Trump will declare victory and walk away from an Iran that will take years to recover, but will eventually menace the world again? Or will America double down, try and assassinate the new leader, and have a say in a more moderate regime? Meanwhile, I don't know about you, but I paid an extra 3p a litre at the pump yesterday. The impact of this war on the government's drive for growth could be horrendous, with unknown political consequences. But is there a glimmer of hope for Sir Keir Starmer? His cautious approach to the United States and cooperation with them seems to have the support of most people, leaving Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch perhaps looking like warmongers. To discuss all this, I'm joined by Joe Phillips, former aide to Lib Dem leader Paddy Ashdown, who himself knew a lot about war and diplomacy. Joe, there's so much to talk about, but first of all, let's talk about this new leader of Iran. It really is meet the new boss, same as the old boss, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And, you could see that it's an act of defiance towards Trump, who bizarrely, as everything he says is bizarre, says, oh, well, that's not acceptable to me. I will only accept a leader that's acceptable to me. But, he has now become so deranged, and his view of the world is based presumably on some sort of video game that he and Pete Hegseth play, that, you can't really take anything sensibly. But what we know about this man is he's 56. Nobody even knows what his voice sounds like. He's very, very kept in the shadows. He's the second of the previous leader's 6 children. He's a mid-ranking cleric. Interestingly, he's also a prolific London property owner, apparently owning 11 mansions on a road in Hampstead in North London, and some luxury apartments in Kensington that overlook the Israeli embassy. Interesting. So, if this is...
I wonder if we'll sanction those properties.
Sorry?
I wonder if we'll sanction those properties.
Well, indeed, but given that we haven't sanctioned the IRG, I think it's rather difficult to know how we're going to do that. So I just, it clearly is a sign of Iran's leadership doubling down. The other of many, many miscalculations that I think Trump made is that the former supreme leader was in his late 80s, was in frail health. So they had been preparing for succession for some time. And I think that's sort of indicative in the fact that he didn't go into hiding. He stayed pretty much in plain sight, probably knowing that he was going to be taken out. And, instead of dying and, just dying of old age and frailty, he died a martyr. So I think it's made things even worse. And it's very difficult to see how they could get much worse, actually.
So what do you think Trump's reaction is going to be of those two alternatives? Do you think he's going to sort of double down, or do you think there's anything in my lingering thought that he's actually seeking an off ramp from this pretty quickly?
You can only seek an off ramp, Jim, if you've said, even in your private circle or in your head, what the end game is. If the end game was to eliminate the previous leader, well, they've done that. But they've now got Mark II, who's only 56. And there have been people, marching on the streets of Iran celebrating the naming of the new leader. The level of ignorance demonstrated by Trump is just beggars belief, frankly. That here we have a country of 93 million people made up of not one indigenous group of people, but many, many tribes, ethnic, sectarian, religious, and geographic groups of people, all with different aims, beliefs, desires, and ideals. So, I mean, what would be the off-ramp for Trump? He obviously didn't have in mind when he went in, unless he was deluded enough to think he was going to do what he did in Venezuela and just take out the leader and then leave the Iranian people to get on with it.
Of course, they have been preparing, the Revolutionary Guard, the regime has been preparing at a number of levels for being decapitated. So this is why it's so difficult to dislodge them. But
Yeah.
but the situation does seem particularly hopeless for a large number of Iranian people. And you say there's been demonstrations on the streets in support of the new Ayatollah, but the BBC Persian have also been contacted by a lot of people who seem to want the United States to now take out the new Ayatollah. So I'm just intrigued by this, whether there's any prospect at all. I mean, apart from anything else, going out on the streets, it's not just the Revolutionary Guard that would gun people down. If the bombs are falling, how can Trump be calling for people to take the streets?
Well, exactly. I mean, the whole thing is, it is beyond the parody of chaos, and it is actually now really quite frightening, I think. And it, if it doesn't alarm you, then it should do, because it has spread throughout the Gulf. I mean, meanwhile, you've got Israeli troops massing on the border with poor old Lebanon. You've got the Gulf states who have been hit. And don't forget, Jim, that up until America's invasion, or America's attack, if you like, on Iran, the Gulf states were sitting down and trying to be mediators with Trump's people. So, they will probably feel slightly annoyed that they've been led along and lied to, that whilst they were sitting there and talking about some possible way of working together, meanwhile America's massing its troops and carrying out these attacks. And of course Israel is doing what Israel always does, which is to say, oh, we're attacking Lebanon because it's the home of Hezbollah, or Hamas, or whoever it happens to say is their particular enemy at any time. And I think, be clear, the Iranian regime is absolutely vile, and it has supported and funded and supplied very, very nasty, evil people, including Hamas and Hezbollah. But the other thing that seems to have been forgotten, and it's interesting that it had a little bit of coverage over the last few days, is that Russia is apparently feeding information to Iran about shipping and about routes that the American fleet are taking. Of course, Trump is dismissing this because he won't hear a bad word against his mate Putin. So where does Russia sit in all of this? Because Russia and Iran were hand in glove supporting Assad in Syria with his awful chemical weapons attacks on his own people. So this isn't something that is just going to be confined to this particular region.
Well, as you mentioned, Russia, let's look at the Russian situation. And the irony of all this is that with the hugely increased oil price, that means more money being pumped into the Russian economy for the prosecution of their war against Ukraine.
Absolutely. And, where does this leave Russia? And of course, China, who gets nearly all its oil from Iran. But there are so many implications of this that if we had got somebody half sensible in the White House, Jim, there would have been people around him saying, well, hang on a minute, this is what happens if you do this. The knock-on effect, you said in the introduction, is the price at the pumps. Well, you and I have seen the price go up here in the UK. Once that starts hitting people in the States, and it has an impact on the price of goods to American consumers, then Trump might have to have a rethink. But, to go back to your very real and very sensible question about Russia, where does Russia sit in this? I mean, Russia is as far as we know, supportive of Iran, will probably welcome the new leader who's been announced today, will support them whether tacitly or openly, and will therefore, by proxy, carry on supporting Hezbollah and Hamas. And as you absolutely correctly say, Jim, meanwhile, poor Ukraine carries on battling. And the other thing, of course, is that whilst these weapons are being used, as I say, like some ghastly video game, there's fewer weapons that can be used to defend and support Ukraine, you know, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, Ukraine is carrying on being absolutely awful, as is Gaza. But we're all looking at Iran, watching the Gulf in flames and worrying about influences in Dubai, when war is raging all around. And the only beneficiaries are people like Putin and Netanyahu.
Yeah, I mean, as far as Gaza is concerned, it's interesting that Hamas have not been able to join Hezbollah in attacking Israel. And I would suggest that Israel's taken a lesson from that and will be hoping to eliminate Hezbollah just as they have prevented Hamas from doing anything in this war.
Well, yes, and I think it's probably fair to say that Hamas has been, you know, severely degraded since the outbreak of hostilities in Gaza. But of course, what happens is if Trump walks away from this, or civil war breaks out in Iran, what you have got, as I outlined earlier, is these various small factions, some of whom may be peaceful, some of whom may not be peaceful, but who will have access to all sorts of weaponry, technology, and so forth. So what is to stop the civil war, a civil war, becoming even more engulfing, pardon the pun, of the whole Gulf?
Turning to another major country, it was a very interesting article, I think, in the Sunday Times last week rather than this week, saying this isn't about Iran, this is about China. And the thesis is that China has been building up its support for Iran, and Iran has become increasingly dependent on Chinese technology. And in return, China gets Iranian oil. And they've also got rights to a port on the Arabian Gulf, and that this is the real overarching strategic issue here, and perhaps explains why America's gone to war, is that they saw China building a very substantial bridgehead in the Middle East, in Iran.
Yes, well, I think, you know, that is the bigger picture, isn't it? It's these players, and it is the shifting of geopolitical power, which is, you know, means China and Russia, and it sort of plays into Trump's view of the world, which is we've got to sort out, you know, this bit of the world, but he can't focus on one area. You know, he's done Venezuela. I'm sure I saw it. I don't know, maybe I imagined it, but there was an attack on Ecuador. He's also been talking about Cuba, which is really suffering because of the shortage of oil getting into Cuba. And China is already very, very strong. But of course, this will put more pressure on the Prime Minister here about the Chinese embassy in London and about relations with China. I think Trump is due to go to China either the end of this month or pretty soon after Easter. And, you know, there's India as well, which is actually now quite a significant player.
And we've had to lift the embargo on India, or India taking Russian oil, because otherwise they wouldn't, with the Gulf of Hormuz closed, they wouldn't be getting any oil at all. So the ironies pile up. I want to turn to the domestic implications of all this in a short while. I mean, let's just deal with one other thing. You know, this suggestion that, you know, if you want to do a regime change, you've got to put boots on the ground. Do we absolutely rule out, because it would certainly be against everything that Trump's ever said? I mean, he's already breached some of the things and caused unease amongst his MAGA base for even going and getting involved in this adventure, that he might actually put American troops on the ground?
I think with Trump, you can't rule anything out, Jim. You know, and I think, as Keir Starmer said last week, you can't do regime change from the air. And also, what are you going to change the regime to? If you're going to go in and say, right, we're removing this dictator and we will stay with you and we will support you as you build civic institutions, civil society and a democracy. I mean, I have limited experience of former Yugoslavia, obviously working with Paddy and going backwards and forwards there, always because it was an infinitely better option to go off to the sound of bombs in Sarajevo than it was to do another fundraising party for the Liberal Democrats. And I'm only joking, but actually it might be fragile, but there was a peace eventually, and that brought together a way of countries and factions living together as they had done before, albeit fragile, but they managed to rebuild. But it required an enormous amount of international support, effort, money, and UN troops on the ground.
And this is a country of 53 million people spread over hundreds of thousands of square miles.
Precisely. And, given that the UN hasn't been involved, given that Congress hasn't been involved in America, given that all the other countries...
A resolution was put down by the Democrats, which was defeated. That's the first glimmer of democracy in the United States, and the Congress did vote to support the war, actually.
Yes, narrowly. You're right. But, if you get to troops on the ground, and we saw the bodies of the 6 American service personnel being returned to their home at the weekend with that appalling picture of Trump standing there with a white baseball cap on, which is just, there's vulgar, there's lack of deference, lack of respect, and you just think it is writ large. Here is a man who can't even be bothered to take off his own self-aggrandizing golf cap at something called the repatriation of dignity or something. It beggars belief, frankly.
Yeah, and there was an awful montage up on the White House website, sort of a mixture of movie monsters and people making aggressive statements. It just beggars belief, the man's lack of self-awareness and how he's dragging down the United States reputation. Just concluding on the international front, we think that his reaction will be to say, this guy's a loser, we're going to try and take him out. You can imagine that Mossad, you made an interesting point, which I don't agree with, that the Ayatollah almost offered himself up on that Saturday morning because he knew he was going to die anyway. The normal interpretation is that it was brilliant intelligence that found them all together, and was the trigger for the war, because it was such a rare opportunity that Mossad's intelligence had actually found that all those leaders were together in one place, and presumably they're working on the same thing now with this new Ayatollah.
Well, yes, and I don't doubt for 1 minute that it was a Mossad operation that had been going on for many, many months in order to track them down. And yes, it was a once in a lifetime opportunity to get them all in one room. But at the same time, the Iranian regime and the Revolutionary Guard have been quite careful that it would seem to be beyond careless, and that he wouldn't go into hiding, the previous leader. So I think there are questions, and I think if you know that your time is coming to an end for health reasons or age reasons, whatever, maybe you would choose to go out as a martyr. You might not have known it was going to happen that day, but it wasn't like there was a defiance of him standing in public making a big speech. It was, they were having a meeting, but they weren't underground in a bunker.
Just trying to look for any cracks in the Iranian regime. There was a strange moment where the president of Iran, who's not the supreme leader, told the Gulf states that they were apologized for attacking them, and they were going to stop the raids, and almost immediately heavy raids recommenced. And one interpretation of that was that actually field commanders are now sort of doing their own thing, and that actually there are slightly more moderate voices there. Do you see any sign of any cracks in the actual regime itself?
I don't know enough about it, Jim, to be able to speak with any authority other than wishful thinking. But I did think it was interesting that the president, who is by and large more moderate, seemed to make a more sort of mollifying sounds, to the Gulf states, their neighbours, and to the rest of the world, if you like. But I think, you put your finger on it. If you've got the generals deciding to work on their own initiative, that way lies sure as hell civil war.
Right. Well, so on the basis that we conclude that, as far as we can tell, this new appointment will merely enrage Donald Trump, and they will bear down on the situation. And as you've said, Israel will continue to do its thing, so to speak, in Lebanon. We now turn to the domestic impact of this. Now, I'll come on later on to Sir Keir Starmer and the way in which he's played this. But first of all, let's look at, the markets, even as we speak, are in turmoil. The oil price is rocketing. Just putting it in a domestic context, in the spring statement last week that was completely, in a sense, invalidated by this, but Rachel Reeves was trying to sort of tell us that there were shoots of recovery, and that's so crucial to the future of this government. But if we're now going to be entering, first of all, an oil shock, followed on by longer term consequences, because the production of things which use oil, fertilizer for crops being held up in the Straits of Hormuz, this is going to make things incredibly difficult for the government. But of course, in a way, will they be able to say, well, it really isn't our fault, and it would be demonstrably the case, people could see that it isn't the fault of the government? Or do you think people are just going to double down on their despair at their continuing lack of dealing with the cost of living?
Well, I think there are several things there. One is that, in normal times, we would, of course, be talking about the spring statement and trying to find something to talk about, and possibly saying, oh, yes, actually, there are some signs of, albeit small and fragile, but there are some signs of recovery. Rachel Reeves is attending a meeting this morning with other G7 nations about this absolute crisis, because crude oil price has gone up to $120 a barrel, which is, $100 was the benchmark. So there is a thought about the joint release of petroleum from reserves, coordinated by the International Energy Association. And that would be the first time since 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. But, if you think about it, a fifth of the world's oil supply comes through the Strait of Hormuz. And as you rightly say, Jim, that has an impact on everything. Even if ships find another way to go round, it takes longer, it's more expensive. We've seen the cost of petrol going up at the forecourts. Imagine what the cost of insurance is. Imagine what the cost of shipping is in the last 10 days. So that will have a huge impact on absolutely everything. And that is everything from, food to service goods, spare parts, and all of those sort of things. So it will have an impact. And I think, yes, people will go, yeah, it's not the government's fault. But the other thing is that we have known for some time that there is there's war in Ukraine, there's war in Gaza, and there has been rumblings about what's been going on in Iran. When you read that we have got only, 2 days supply of gas because the previous government got rid of, it was David Cameron, in fact, closed down our storage facilities. When you get to the point of food shortages, energy shortages, never mind price increases, you will then have people in this country really turning on the government and really saying, hang on a minute, what have you done to protect us? Because the first duty of government is to protect its people. And we've spoken about this before, about resilience and preparedness. And it is absolutely fundamentally clear that we have got no plan, no preparedness for food security, for energy security, for water security. We can't even supply water during peacetime, never mind if we're under attack. And never mind the sort of cyber attacks that may come. You're laughing, Jim. You seem to be taking...
No, I mean, but we do have our water supply. You are referring, obviously, to these awful sewage outflows and things like that.
No,
but
I'm not. I'm talking about people in Tunbridge Wells, for goodness sake, who have been without water for weeks on end.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, Zach Polanski has the answer. Really beat our renewable energy. This is, that oil is so volatile that we need to be moving away from it as fast as we possibly can to, to provide energy through renewables.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think we are going in the right direction. I think it's about the only sensible thing that Zach Polanski has to say, because actually I think he is the danger on the left, just as Reform and Restore Britain are on the right. And I think, we should be...
Let's talk about Ed Miliband's role, because Ed Miliband has clearly been a warrior for the Green Revolution, in terms of and things like that. Do you think his position is strengthened by this? That he can point to the fact that we just cannot continue to rely not only on sort of the malevolence of countries like Russia, that's pretty much as a taken, but because of the volatility of oil and gas prices, we really got to try and really beef up our own renewables.
Yes, I do, up to a point, Lord Copper, because I think the problem is that you've got such a chorus of the media who are so anti-net zero because it's woke, it's putting a cost on X, Y, and Z. They don't like Ed Miliband because of the bacon sandwich. They think he's a bit, preachy and all the rest of it. And yet it is quite obvious, in the same way as you and I would be thinking about alternative supplies of heating, lighting, whatever, whether that's candles and logs or Primus stoves or whatever. I mean, both you and I, Jim, are old enough to remember the 3-day week, and I grew up on a farm where I thought everybody, had at least one night a week where they didn't have any electricity. But it is just one of those things that we have been sleepwalking into climate change, and we have been sleepwalking into ignoring how to do things better. I mean, Nick Clegg, said there's no point in building nuclear energy solutions because it'll take 20 years to come to fruition. Well, that was 2010. Here we are, quarter century later. Wouldn't it have been a good idea, dear Nick, to have done that? So yes, I think there are those things, but I think that's why Keir Starmer's approach is actually right. And what I am so angry about and disappointed about is the line from Tony Blair particularly, but also Kemi Badenoch and also Nigel Farage, which is this is a time actually where this should be cross-party and parties should come together, and it should almost be a sort of a wartime coalition, if you like, and we go, actually, let's talk about the things that we need to tell the public about safety, security, protection and resilience, instead of going, no, we should just do whatever Trump wants.
Well, on that subject, of course, we haven't seen party unity in the face of an international crisis, which we do sometimes. We of course had Donald Trump saying, "You're no Winston Churchill," to which my response would be,
"You're no Roosevelt."
Exactly, who knew how to behave in terms of a crisis. But we've also had Kemi Badenoch, and I'm a little surprised at this, but particularly Farage, who apparently has been at the Trump headquarters in Mar-a-Lago. I thought that given that Reform are coming under increasing criticism for their closeness to Donald Trump, who's not popular in Britain, I'm very surprised that he went there for this. But anyway, but the position of Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage is that as this war broke out, we should have said you can use American bases for explicit attacks on Iran. And Sir Keir Starmer said no. Then, and the sequencing of this is quite tricky, but it appears then that Hezbollah fired a drone at a warehouse in Cyprus, which obviously is a British sovereign base. And on that basis, Starmer changed his position and said, you can use British bases now because our Cyprus is under attack, and also our civilians and our military bases in the Gulf states are under attack. And it does seem, Joe, that from what we can tell from opinion polls, that most of the British people seem to support this cautious approach rather than the more gung-ho approach of Farage and Kemi Badenoch.
Yes, I agree. And I think, part of that is because I think you're absolutely right, Jim, is that the British public don't like Donald Trump. They think he's a bully. They think he's rude. They think he's ignorant. And I think, little things like that picture of him with his baseball cap on as the coffins of service personnel, it doesn't go down well with the British public. Remember how agitated people got about Michael Foot in his donkey jacket, or Rishi Sunak leaving the D-Day commemorations early. We actually take those sort of things very seriously. And I think Nigel Farage is very out of touch with the British public. But, that's another story. I think Keir Starmer was absolutely right. I think the problem for the government is that their position would have looked much stronger had they had a warship in the Mediterranean. And I think the problem is that, you can say, no, you can't use our bases for an offensive action. And then you can quite legitimately say, but we will support you in defensive action, which is fair enough. I think the problem is, as soon as he says international law, people go, "Oh, you're a human rights lawyer," like they do, and that's a little bit like the net zero argument, that you've got such a hostile press that everything is. There is this sort of, where do you even begin, Jim? When people attack international law because it suits them to break the law or ignore the law, as is clearly apparent with Trump. People they sort of forget that international law also applies to international standards on medicines, on cars, on vehicle parts, on airline safety, on a whole load of things that affect our daily lives. And if you don't have some sort of international law, which gives you some sort of guardrails and some sort of sense of cohesion and consensus, if you like, and bearing in mind it came after the Second World War, after the appalling Holocaust and what the Nazis did and everything else that we know about that happened in the 1930s. International law is there for a reason. It's how you interpret it is the question that needs to be asked. But to just disregard it because you want regime change seems to be fundamentally wrong. I don't think Keir Starmer articulated the reasons in a way that was particularly digestible or understandable to the public, because it came across as sort of equivocation. And I do think, this is where I do think the government got it wrong. We've got a very depleted defence capability. We haven't got a warship that was in the Mediterranean. So, we have seen this build up because it's been in the papers and on the television for weeks and weeks and weeks that America was building stuff up, that there was a possibility of action taking place in Iran at some point. You would have thought, wouldn't you, that it might be more useful to have a warship possibly nearer to the Mediterranean than Portsmouth. And I think that's where the government looks as though it's fallen short. But I think Keir Starmer's been absolutely right to just say, no, I'm not going in this. Apart from anything else, as far as I understand it, Jim, we were not formally asked until America had made the decision to go in and attack. And you can't ask somebody to support you unless you say, right, the end game is X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, well, that's why I think Mossad and maybe with American satellite intelligence identified a moment when they'd all be in that meeting on the Saturday morning, and that is actually what triggered it, and that's what would explain the complete lack of consultation with allies, which partly put Keir Starmer in a difficult position. But it just seems to me that at the moment, in terms of Starmer's future, there are one or two things which will actually keep him in place. One being, of course, that you do not move against the Prime Minister when the globe is in a state like it is now, with wars going all over the place. There's no question of that happening. But that his cool, rather dull, steady sort of leadership might get some credit with the British people, and therefore put off leadership challenges going forward. We must have a word about Sir Ed Davey, who's becoming more and more robust in his criticism of President Trump. The criticism would be that he's a long way from power, and that if he was leader of the UK, it would have a serious effect on our special relationship. Whereas this sort of to and fro about whether Starmer is Churchill or not is fairly superficial, and the underlying intelligence and cooperation with the United States remains intact. But your thoughts on Sir Ed?
Well, I am very fond of Ed. I think he's a good bloke, and he has led the Liberal Democrats to their, greatest parliamentary success, for donkey's years. I do think the Liberal Democrats are not featuring as much as they should, and I know there are feelings within the party that it is time for a new leader, not because people are unhappy with Ed, but I think a fresh face and a different thing. I mean, he can afford to be quite insulting about Trump, actually, because, as you say, he's not going to be in power. He's not in power. But I think, the Liberal Democrats speak for many people in this country when they are quite happy to say, Trump is a bully. He's appalling. He's got no end game. He's got no strategy. He's got no sense of history. In the same way as the Liberal Democrats can afford to be absolutely unequivocal about their attitude to Europe, because that's where they've always been. They want to be back in the EU, so they don't have to walk around on a pinhead. The Liberal Democrats always, even back in my day, 500 years ago, got squeezed out. In those days, they got squeezed out by Labour and the Tories. Now they're squeezed out because you've got Reform and you've got the Greens. And I dare say there are people in the Conservative Party who feel that they're being squeezed out. That, when you hear the reactions from various party leaders, you now hear Zach Polanski. Well, a year ago, few of us had heard of Zach Polanski. So you've got, Nigel Farage, unelected Zach Polanski, unelected in the sense he's not an MP, and the Liberal Democrats are sort of bumbling through the middle. But I do think as the Greens go further and further to the left, and certainly extreme policies that might be more appropriate, more acceptable to people who supported Jeremy Corbyn, that you might find the previous Green supporters support the Lib Dems, but the Lib Dems need to have a bit of oomph. You can't get into power with just being nice, but you can have a voice and you can have a useful contribution to politics. Because the other thing is that the rest of the world goes.
I generally agree with what you're saying about Sir Ed Davey, and that maybe it is time for a change. But I do think on this particular issue, he has carved out a distinctive position of really calling out Donald Trump, and that is surely what you're crying out for, a distinctive position from the Lib Dems that people can take notice of.
Yes, absolutely. But unfortunately, he then slightly blows it by bringing up in the Commons the influences in Dubai. And of course, he articulates what many people, including myself, think, that frankly, who cares what happens to Isabel Oakeshott or the so-called influencers who have gone over there because they don't want to pay tax in this country and are now bleating about getting home at our expense. But I don't think that was particularly statesmanlike. You don't do that as a party leader. You might put it out on social media, or you might leave somebody else in the party to do it. But that's what he will be, and that's what he was sort of sneered at and laughed at for saying. And it doesn't make him look very serious, even though I think he does speak for a lot of the public. But just on the point of leaders, let's just digress for 1 minute to a former leader, Tony Blair. How helpful was that intervention? Not.
Yes, extraordinary, considering that we've recently had a TV series on Tony Blair's life. And, obviously the Iraq War did loom over his prime ministership. Whatever good he did on the domestic front with New Labour and all that sort of thing, he was absolutely the man for the hour in terms of, renewing our hospitals and schools, Sure Start, and then the Iraq War. I was quite surprised on two fronts. One, that it is his great legacy weakness, and he seems to be a man who is a bit concerned about his legacy. To actually take that stance would immediately revive all the controversy about the decision he took to stay by Bush with the Iraq War. And the second thing is that, you know, in a time of difficulty, is it the role of a former prime minister to attack our prime minister? I was really genuinely quite surprised by that.
Yeah, me too. And also, you know, he's been in politics and he knows the game probably better than anybody alive. You go to a public meeting and you say, oh, these comments weren't meant for, you know, it was a private meeting. These comments weren't meant to be public. Well, how naive do you have to be? You know, the man who sort of invented spin alongside Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson, everything you say is going to be reported. And I think it was singularly unhelpful. And I think that, you know, Keir Starmer has got quite enough on his plate without Tony Blair weighing in. And I thought Yvette Cooper, who I think is normally rather weak and weedy, was quite robust yesterday in her Laura Kuenssberg interview.
Well, you know, the last thing I just want to mention is that, you know, you've referred to our defence inadequacies. And of course, the way to change that is to spend more of our budget as fast as possible on defence. But then the question is whether the British people are going to be prepared to take the consequences for welfare or the triple lock or whatever it might take. Do you see the government now accelerating this 3% target?
I think they have to. And I think, you know, whether or not we like it, I think, you know, now is the time. And if Keir Starmer and Al Carnes and John Healey can actually stand up and say to people, I mean, Kemi Badenoch said she'd pay for increase in defence by, you know, bringing back the 2-child benefit cap. Why attack children? Why attack families? Isn't it better to say to, you know, people like us, Jim, take away the triple lock, because you're actually then giving that money to try and prevent your grandchildren going to war? It's a much better argument. But, you know, Keir Starmer's got a long way to go before he can articulate anything sensible. He needs to keep Rachel Reeves out of the limelight because she doesn't deliver anything. And John Healey's actually quite good. But, you know, it's quite clear that there are mixed feelings within defence and military circles. There are people like Richard Sheriff who say, no, Keir Starmer's absolutely right. There's Richard Dannett saying, no, he's absolutely ridiculous. You know, he's using this sort of legal basis for not going in. And I think now is the time for the Prime Minister to be able to say to the public, look, you see what happens. We've got a real problem. This is going to affect everything. We've only been talking about the cost of living. Think about the effect on immigration, Jim, as people flee these burning states in the Gulf. You know, they're all going to be heading towards Europe. And, you know, quite rightly, people will go, well, hang on, we don't know whether they're Iran sleeper cells or Hezbollah or Hamas or whatever. So you've got all of those things. So I think now is the time to say to people, look, we've got to defend ourselves. If you, on the one hand, to say, oh, actually, we can't get a warship and we haven't got any storage facilities for gas, you've got to do something about it. But you need to do it quickly, boldly, and be really confident. And Labour MPs, as we've said many times before, have just got to get behind the Prime Minister.
Joe, thank you very much indeed. You've been battling with a very bad cold, so particularly grateful to you. Grateful to our producer, Francesca King. Frank will be back next week with all the news from MIPIM, where I'm sure all these global economic issues that are coming up will have been discussed. So we look forward to hearing from him. And in the meantime, stay safe.